The year is 1918. The Great War, known today as World War I, has finally came to a close with an Entente Powers victory. In the French south coast, near the Italian border, lie the French-protected Principality of Monaco, one of the smallest independent nations in the world with a rich culture and history. Throughout the First World War, Monaco had remained neutral, easily managing to avoid war, since all fronts were far from the Principality. With the Great War, the war to end all wars having come to a close with Monaco completely untouched, it seemed as if peace had forever came to the micronation. Little did Monaco and its people know that it would only be 20 years afterward that war would once again come, but this time it would come directly towards Monaco's doorstep. In 1922, Monaco's reigning monarch since 1889, Prince Albert I, an international outstanding achieving monarch in academics, sciences, and who had brought Monaco into the modern age with a 1911 constitution, passed away, leaving his son Louis to succeed him and become Prince Louis II of Monaco on June 26, 1922. Louis was born and raised in Germany. He later served in the French army from 1895 to 1899, and re-enlisted again from 1914 to 1918, having fought in the First World War, and became a brigadier general. He returned to Monaco after the Great War, where he became prince. His reign over the Principality in the following years, while not as achieving as his father's, would leave an impressionable mark on the nation. The Association Sportive de Monaco Football Club, better known as AS Monaco, was formed in 1924, and the first of Monaco's world-famous Grand Prix would be held on April 14, 1929. The post-war world had been great for Monaco, but as the years kept passing, tensions in Europe once again began to rise. In 1922, Benito Mussolini became prime minister in a coup d'etat of Monaco's neighbor Italy and began to set up the new Italian fascist regime. A similar event would take place further north in 1933. The National Socialist German Workers' Party, or the Nazi Party, under the leadership of Adolf Hitler, took power in Germany. Tensions would continue to rise in Europe over the next few years until, in 1939, after Nazi Germany annexed Austria, the Sudetenland, and occupied Bohemia, Moravia, and Slovakia. War broke out with the invasion of Poland on September 1st, 1939. A few days later, Great Britain and Monaco's protector France declared war on Germany, beginning the Second World War. When war broke out, Monaco immediately declared itself a neutral, non-aligned nation, just like it had done in the First World War. But in case of getting caught up in the fighting, 800 of the country's residents were mobilized, and 300 French soldiers were sent to the Principality in order to secure the nation's sovereignty, mainly in the event of an invasion from Nazi Germany's ally, Fascist Italy. Prince Louis, who was strongly pro-French, mainly due to his past allegiances to the French military, paraded throughout his country wearing French military uniforms in an attempt to galvanize his people into Allied support. However, his attempts were left in vain, as most of Monaco's population was of Italian descent, and were in support of Nazi Germany's ally, Fascist Italy. Despite the lack of support for the Allies, most Monegasques predicted a French victory, and after sitting back and watching from the sidelines as the nation had done in the First World War, no one really thought that war would come to the wealthy micronation. Most Monegasques assumed that just like in the First World War, the French and their allies would thoroughly defeat the Germans, and the war would come to a conclusion with the microstate once again unharmed. Even after the fall of Poland, Denmark, and Norway, there were still high expectations of an Allied victory. However, Monaco's entire situation changed when the Benelux countries fell, and the Allied forces were encircled in the Ardennes by a German blitzkrieg, wiping out thousands of French and Allied soldiers as the Germans speed-rolled towards Paris. A French victory appeared more and more unlikely. The situation became far worse when Monaco's other neighbor, Italy, joined the war with Germany and began an offensive against France in the Alps, within miles of Monaco. In response to the Italian offensive, the Monegasque government began to arrest and suppress pro-Italian and fascist supporters. To Monaco, it was clear the times of peace and prosperity were over, and the war had came to Monte Carlo's doorstep. As the French forces collapsed, emergency plans were laid out by French and Monegasque governments to evacuate civilians, which were never executed. The Principality's fate was sealed when Paris fell to the Germans, and not long after, the rest of France. With its protector defeated, French troops remaining in Monaco were withdrawn from the microstate, as the Germans and Italians moved into their occupation zones. Thus, Monaco became an enclave in the Italian occupation zone, but was officially under the protection and influence of the new Axis puppet, Vichy France. This new French state, however, was under the command of an old adversary of Louis II. Marshal Philippe Pétain, a well-renowned French general, had fought with Louis in the First World War, and the two were good friends. Louis and his government's sympathies were strongly pro-French, but despite his old friend's collaboration with the Axis, Louis supported Pétain in the Vichy government until its dissolution in late 1942 at the hands of the Axis powers, who during the years following the defeat of France fiercely disputed the micronation status, and the Principality's fate was of constant discussion between Axis leaders. Fascist Italy, who had large ambitions on expansion in the Mediterranean, wanted to invade and annex Monaco for its pro-French sentiments, along with its treatment of pro-Italians and fascists. However, the Italians' Axis adversary, the Third Reich, insisted that the micronation remain independent and neutral, despite its clear French and anti-fascist biases, since the country made for a useful global trade and finance hub for acquiring foreign currency, and German companies in Monaco facilitated much of Germany's global trade with neutral nations, which was vital to the Reich's war machine. The Nazis eventually negotiated the Italians out of invading and annexing the country. For now, Monaco's status as an independent, neutral state remained, much to the annoyance of the Italians. However, this accepted neutrality did not mean Monaco could ignore the Axis and act on its own. In order to avoid invasion and maintain its sovereignty, Monaco was forced to collaborate with and given to many Axis demands. Monaco was coerced into entering a series of financial agreements with the Nazi government. At the demands of Fascist Italy, ceded control of its port, and made the Italian language mandatory use. It also didn't help the nation that Prince Louis's leadership proved weak and indecisive during this difficult time, and allowed for more control and influence of the Principality to fall into Axis hands. Along with other orders, the Monegasque government also made sure to put its population into submission at the demands of the Axis by suppressing and arresting anti-fascists along with its Jewish population. On the night of August 27th, 1942, Monegasque authorities rounded up and arrested many Jewish civilians, refugees, and handed them over to the Gestapo, the vast majority of whom would perish in the Holocaust. Throughout the war, Monegasque authorities would be directly responsible for the deportation of some 90 Jewish civilians and refugees to concentration camps, of which only around 5 would survive. Despite holding responsibility for the deportation of Jewish civilians and refugees, Prince Louis II and his government secretly attempted to prevent the deportation of as many Jews as possible, and throughout the war, the nation became a shelter for European Jews, with hundreds finding refuge in Monaco. Jewish citizens were given fake identity papers to hide their true being, and Monegasque authorities warned ahead of time those who were the target or were to be arrested by the Gestapo. The efforts made by Louis and his administration likely saved hundreds or even thousands of lives. Despite the many Axis demands forced upon the Principality, practically making the nation an Axis puppet, Fascist Italy still desired total control and influence over the microstate, and began preparations to seize the Principality for its own. The Italians knew that their German ally protected the sovereignty of the Principality and would not allow the conquest of the territory without having a justification for an invasion. So the Italians investigated. It was discovered that Monaco had in-use French defense installations along its coastline, put in place by the French government during the interwar period, and the Italians claimed that their continued use after France's fall was proof of Monaco's non-neutrality. Because the Principality and its leadership was widely known to be pro-French, rumors and later claims began to spread of Monaco secretly aiding French resistances within occupied Europe, although there was no solid evidence for these claims. It was also discovered that an American consulate was recently established within the Principality, which caused concern that the nation would come under US influence and was seen as potentially dangerous since America was now at war with the Axis. The Italians saw these French defense installations, the possible secret support for French resistances, and the newly established diplomatic relations between Monaco and America as threats to Italian control and influence over the nation, and was able to justify an invasion. On November 11th, 1942, officially for strategic reasons, the Italian army entered the Principality of Monaco and firmly occupied the nation within a few days. The American consulate was first targeted by Italian forces and would be dismantled shortly after the invasion, and French defense installations along the coast were seized. In the days of the invasion, Prince Louis would write to Adolf Hitler and Pope Pius XII, protesting the occupation of his country. But the prince would receive little help, if any, from the Nazis or the Vatican. The Italians established a puppet administration in the Principality. Louis II was allowed to maintain his position as prince, but with very limited power and authority. Now firmly under Italian occupation and administration, those who had been previously arrested in the Principality for Italian and fascist support were released from Monegasque authorities, and the suppression of anti-fascists and resistances heavily intensified. The occupation was extremely harsh on the nation and would see the country reduced to a mere Axis vassal state. Italian occupation lasted for almost 10 months, until the Italian fascist regime was toppled from power, and the new Italian government signed an armistice with the Allied powers. The Italians' former ally, Nazi Germany, who had already suspected Italy's surrender, quickly took action. Italian troops were disarmed, and territory not yet captured by Allied forces came under Nazi occupation. As the Italians left, the Germans moved in. Along with most of Italy, Monaco came under the occupation of the Nazis. They were initially welcomed into the Principality by Prince Louis and his government in hopes of maintaining their positions in the country, but mainly in part because the past 10 months under Italian occupation was particularly difficult for the microstate, and the prince used his German origins as a connection with the new occupiers. The Nazis established an oversight administration in the Principality and allowed Monaco to mostly govern itself. The Nazis were still determined to keep the country neutral with their supervision. German businesses were once again allowed to continue global trade and finance in the nation, as if the country was neutral and unoccupied, since it was claimed by both Nazi and Monegasque governments that the Principality was neutral, and because of this fact, it has been said that the Principality was given special treatment by Germany. A joint police force was also created during the occupation, with both Nazi and Monegasque authorities, which targeted resistance fighters, black market activity, and Jews. These forces would, throughout the occupation, arrest, deport, and even execute those who resisted the new administration. Much to Prince Louis's dismay, he and his old government were unable to do much about the numerous crimes that would be committed in the Principality during the Nazi occupation. In the summer of 1944, railway lines supplying the Principality with food, fresh water, and other resources were destroyed by Allied bombardments, resulting in many of these needed goods being cut off from the country until the end of the war, which caused a large part of the Principality's population to go malnourished. The Axis occupations were some of the darkest points in the history of the Principality of Monaco, but luckily for the tiny nation, there was hope on the horizon. In August 1944, Allied forces landed on the southern coast of France and quickly advanced through the occupied country and onto the doorstep of Monaco. As the Allies approached closer and closer to Monaco, the country suffered massive Allied bombardments, destroying large parts of its infrastructure, particularly striking structures near its harbor, crippling the nation. The nearly year-long Nazi occupation finally came to a close when the rapid Allied advance forced the Nazis to withdraw from Monaco on September 2nd, 1944, and for a day, the Principality was abandoned, until an American contingent force arrived on the 3rd of September, officially liberating the country from Axis hands. Concluding Monaco's story in the Second World War. Despite the horrors and destruction, Monaco had survived the Second World War, and the country began the difficult process of reconstruction. The nation would do so under the protection and influence of the newly established French Fourth Republic. Ever since its liberation, Monaco has often been criticized for its collaboration with the Axis powers, and especially for its treatment of its Jewish population during the war. Despite the known crimes, it was decided that no war trials would be held in the Principality. Since the end of the war, the Prince of Monaco and his government have made a formal apology for the crimes committed in the Principality during the Second World War. On August 27, 2015, 73 years after the deportation of many Jewish civilians and refugees, Prince Albert II of Monaco unveiled a monument dedicated to those who died in concentration camps during the war. September 3rd is now a Monegasque national holiday, commemorating the day Monaco was liberated from the Axis. Prince Louis II, who was largely absent in the Reconstruction era, possibly for guilt of the crimes committed during his reign, would live out the majority of his remaining days in France. He would pass away in the Prince's Palace of Monaco, 5 years after the liberation of his country, in 1949. Louis only had one child, his daughter Princess Charlotte, but she had ceded her succession rights to her son, and so Louis would be succeeded by his grandson, Rainier III. Louis II, while not an outstanding achiever like his father, or a strong-willed leader like monarchs of the past, had seen his country through the darkest of its times. While his indecisive leadership during the war had allowed for more influence over the Principality to fall into Axis hands, it is undeniable that his leadership had also saved the lives of hundreds, if not thousands of Monegasque civilians and refugees. He was anything but perfect, but his guidance and leadership had saved the Principality from further horrors and destruction. His reign would forever leave a mark on the nation, one that forged modern Monaco. Under the Principality's new monarch, and with the support of the rest of Western Europe, the country would be guided into a new golden age. Today, Monaco has not only recovered from the disasters of the Second World War, but has built itself back, and even greater than before, into what we know today as one of the wealthiest and most influential nations in not just Europe, but the whole world.